Welcome, dear listener, to Campbell Sleep Tales, where the light is soft, the pace unhurried, and each story carries you deeper into dream. Tonight's journey is drawn from 9 Nights by Candlelight, a cycle of tales that drift through the turning of seasons. It begins in the serene bloom of early spring, passes into the long light of summer and the quiet mysteries of autumn, and settles into the deep shadow and frost of winter. With each chapter, you will move from warmth to cold, from openness to secrecy, and finally back into stillness again. These stories are not hurried. They are told in the time it takes for frost to form on the sill, for light to fade from a marsh, for the wind to turn in the branches. Here you will find blooming lilies that appear but once in 1,000 years, orchards whose fruit hangs on silver threads, forests lit by lantern pods, mirrors that forget your reflection, and the slow, patient approach of things that wake only in the coldest months. If the telling pleases you, lend us your light, like, comment, and subscribe, so that each time we set another candle to burn, you will be here to see it. Now let us begin, and walk together into the first breath of thaw, where the marsh stirs and carries the faint memory of a blossom that blooms but once in 1,000 years. The 1,000-Year Lily, Chapter 1, The Marsh in Winter. The marsh lay in a sleep so deep it seemed older than memory. Its waters held the stillness of ice without freezing, its air smelling faintly of peat and rain. Pale sedges bent beneath the weight of their own frost, and the reeds rattled softly in a wind that never reached the trees beyond. Those who lived along its edge spoke little of the lily. They knew the tale well, though no one alive had seen it open. It was said to bloom once in 1,000 years, lifting its white crown above the black water, bright enough to make the marsh shimmer like daylight. The elders told of how the bloom drew people from beyond the hills, though they could never say what became of them afterward. The old words were careful. It was not a flower to be harvested, nor a sight to be sought for gain. It was to be witnessed, and then left to close. In winter, the marsh seemed to gather itself, as though drawing breath. The snow lay thin here, clinging in patches to the tussocks. Ice formed in faint films over the shallow pools, breaking at a single touch. Along the central channel where the water ran dark and deep, the lily's root was said to sleep. No one marked the spot. The marsh had a way of swallowing signs and stones alike. A girl named Mirith walked its edge that season, as she did every year when the frost first came. Her father had been a warden of the marsh, and though she had no post nor duty, she felt the pull of its quiet. She stepped on the hummocks where the ground held firm, listening to the dull thud of her boots on frozen moss. The air carried a taste of something green beneath the cold, as though the roots of the marsh still dreamed of summer. She stopped near the place where the stream entered, a ribbon of clearer water threading through the peat. The reeds there had fallen in a perfect arc, as if bent by a single great hand. She crouched, brushing the frost from a cluster of leaves that rose from the water's edge. They were thicker than any she had seen before, their green deep and unspotted despite the season. When she touched them, they felt warmer than the air. Mirith said nothing. She rose, stepping back onto firmer ground. As the sun set beyond the hills overlooking the marsh, the water's surface reflected its golden light, highlighting the frost along the edges. Beneath this black mirror, the root remained undisturbed as the year continued its quiet progression toward its 1,000th night. In that tranquil scene, the marsh was not devoid of life. Lanterns moved along its edge, their light blurred in the mist. Men and women from the nearest villages had come in silence, their breath rising pale against the dark. No voices called, the air seemed to press against the tongue, urging quiet. The water lay black and unbroken save for the narrow channels where the frost had thinned. A stillness deeper than wind held the sedges. It was not the stillness of sleep, but of waiting, as though every reed and stone leaned toward the same hour. Mireth stood among them, her hood drawn close. She had risen before the moon's climb, drawn by a certainty she could not name. She carried no lantern. The light from the others was enough to pale the mist at her feet, yet left the far water in shadow. It began without sound. A pale swelling beneath the water, like a moon glimpsed through cloud. Slowly, the shape rose, pushing aside the surface without breaking it, until a single bud stood in the open air. Its petals were closed, their edges faintly silver in the dark. A breath seemed to move through the marsh, though no wind stirred. The petals trembled once, twice, and then began to open. Each fold moved with such slowness that the watching eyes could follow every curve, every reveal of the inner glow. It was not a light that blazed, but one that seeped outward, soft and steady, filling the mist until faces were lit from below. Mireth's eyes stung, though the glow was gentle. She saw the lines of the lily's heart, veined with a gold so fine it might have been woven. Around her, no one shifted. Some stood with their eyes closed, as if listening for something. The glow thickened, warm enough to lift the scent of wet earth and green water into the air. In that hour, the marsh seemed larger, the darkness beyond its edge falling away. The lily's crown swayed once, a motion like breath drawn and released. The gold threads along its heart caught the light, sending faint ripples over the faces of those gathered. No shadow fell here. All was held in that same even glow. Then, as slowly as it had opened, the lily began to close. The glow thinned, folding inward until only a pale bud remained, heavy with dew. The mist returned to its silver gray, the marsh to its size. Lanterns cast their gentle glow along the riverbank as the group remained silent. With the passage of time, the watchers started to retreat back into the night, leaving only their faint footsteps in the moss. Mireth lingered a while longer, gazing at the spot where the flower had once bloomed. The water mirrored the tranquility of the scene, retaining just a whisper of the light that had graced it earlier. In Chapter 3, The Stillness, after the marsh came to life under the soft light of dawn. Mist lay low over the water, as if reluctant to lift, and frost silvered the reeds until they seemed carved from glass. The air was sharper than the night before, yet the scent of green lingered faintly, threading through the cold. Mireth walked the bank where the watchers had stood. Their footprints pressed dark shapes into the frozen moss, already softening at the edges. No voices broke the air. The villagers had returned to their homes in silence, carrying whatever the night had given them. Where the lily had bloomed, the water was unchanged. The black surface held no reflection but the sky, pale and empty. She knew the root still slept below, its 1,000 years beginning anew with the turn of that night. There would be no more bloom in her lifetime, nor in the lifetime of any who had stood beside her. She crouched, resting her palm against the damp ground. The earth was warmer here, faintly pulsing with a heat that seemed to rise from deep below. A droplet of water slid from a reed, catching the light before falling back into the channel with a sound so small it barely disturbed the air. Far off, a crane lifted from the marsh, its wings slow and deliberate. The beat of them stirred the mist into thin veils that drifted toward the trees. Mireth watched until the bird was only a dark thread against the sky. As she turned to go, the quiet seemed to follow her. It was not the quiet of absence, but of something held, as though the marsh had taken the night's glow into itself, keeping it beneath the water and the frost, waiting for a time none could name. When she reached the edge of the village, the roofs were lit by the first touch of sun. A man stacking wood paused and looked toward the marsh, his eyes fixed on nothing she could see. In the stillness between them she felt the weight of the hour that had passed and the long stretch of years that would follow. The lily had closed, but its light lingered, thin and hidden, in the breath of the earth. Before the stillness of the marsh had fully faded, another place began to take shape in the mind. High above the lowlands, where the wind never tires and the air tastes of stone and sunlight. It is said there is an orchard there, unlike any that grows in soil. Its fruit does not hang but drifts, suspended by silver threads, each carrying a flavor that stirs a memory long thought lost. The Sky Orchard, Chapter 1, The Plateau. At the crest of the wind-scoured plateau, the orchard stood in rows that had no beginning or end. Each tree rose from stone, its roots locked in fissures that reached down into the plateau's bones. The branches arched like the ribs of great ships, each heavy with drifting fruit that tugged gently at their silver stems, swaying in the wind's long breath. The air here was unlike the valleys below, thinner, sharper, yet softened by a faint sweetness that came from no blossom. The wind came low over the ridge in endless waves, carrying scents that shifted with the hours: resin at dawn, sun-warmed stone at midday, a dry floral note at twilight. The fruit changed color under this turning light. Gold to rose, rose to pale green, green to a deep shade that was neither blue nor black. The old man who tended the orchard moved with deliberate care, his hands browned and lined from decades of work. His ladder leaned against one tree, though he climbed it rarely. The fruit was for the traveler who arrived with open hands, not for the keeper himself. His only request was always the same: plant a seed before you leave. No one saw where the seeds went, nor how the orchard seemed to grow without seedlings. Yet with each passing season, the rose stretched farther along the plateau, vanishing into the horizon. That autumn, the wind carried with it a traveler, a woman with dust on her boots and a leather satchel across her shoulder. She came without haste, her eyes following the strange shimmer above the treetops. The orchard's sound reached her before its sight, the faint ringing of stems in the wind, as if the silver threads hummed with the strain of holding their fruit aloft. The old man greeted her with a nod. No words passed until she had walked among the trees and chosen one whose fruit glowed with a muted silver. The ladder creaked under her weight as she climbed. When her fingers closed on the stem, it parted as easily as a hair loosens in water. She held the fruit close, its skin cool, its light gentle on her hands. The first bite stilled her breath. Flavor spilled over her tongue. Not sweetness, but the taste of a day long buried. A day she had not remembered until now. A field of rye in the first weeks of summer, the call of swallows above, the warmth of someone's hand steadying her as she crossed a furrow. Her eyes closed, and the wind moved through the orchard as if in answer. She descended the ladder and sat upon the stone roots, eating slowly. The old man sat nearby, hands folded, watching the stars begin their slow climb above the ridges. The fruit in the branches swayed, glowing faintly as the night deepened. When she finished, the traveler held the seed in her palm, pale, small, and smooth as river stone. She placed it into the keeper's hand without question. As night fell on the plateau, a gentle hush enveloped the air, and the wind's melody grew softer. The orchard appeared to bow inward, seemingly attentive to the tranquil breathing of its caretaker and his visitor. Above, the luminescent fruits shimmered against the night sky, their light outlining the branch structures akin to celestial constellations rooted to the ground. Chapter 2. The Present of Seeds. The first light struck the fruit before it touched the ground, kindling their skins into warm fire. The air carried the night's coolness still, threaded with the dry scent of stone and a faint trace of the fruit's inner sweetness. The traveler woke to the wind's soft hum through the silver stems. She found the old man already walking the rows, his steps sure on the uneven rock. In his hands he carried a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. He paused at certain trees, leaning close to the base where root met stone, and from the box he would take something small and pale, pressing it into the fissures with the tip of his finger. "You plant them yourself," she said at last, following him between the rows. He glanced over his shoulder, the lines of his face deep in the morning light. "I keep them safe until the time comes. A seed is not ready the day it leaves the fruit." They walked on. She saw how the orchard stretched farther than she had guessed the night before. Some trees were young, their trunks slender, the fruit fewer. Others bore scars in the bark where wind or time had torn branches away. Yet all stood rooted in the same deep stone, drinking from whatever water lay hidden beneath. At a tree whose branches hung with gold fruit, the old man stopped. He knelt and pried a loose shard of stone aside, revealing a narrow hollow. From his box he chose a seed no larger than a grain of barley and set it within. The hollow was covered again, the shard fitting neatly back into place. She crouched beside him. "If the seeds are planted, why do none sprout?" "They do," he said, "but not where we can see." The wind stirred the branches above them, and the fruit swayed, their glow shifting through colors. She thought of the memory that had risen in her mouth the night before, vivid as the taste of the fruit itself. If such a seed could take root beyond sight, what would it grow into and where? They reached the edge of the orchard where the plateau dropped sharply into the valleys. From here, the world below looked muted and distant. The old man set the box down, resting his hands on the stone. "Some seeds go down," he said, nodding toward the cliff, "and some go up. The wind decides." She followed his gaze and saw, far off above the ridge, a single silver thread drifting away into the high air, as if a seed had taken flight in the night. It caught the morning sun, gleaming once before vanishing into the sky. The old man picked up his box and began walking back into the orchard. She followed, glancing often at the place where the thread had disappeared, wondering where in the wide air such a seed might choose to fall. Chapter 3. When the Wind Turns. The season on the plateau was changing. Days shortened, and the wind that had once carried warmth from the valleys now came sharper, with the bite of snow on its breath. The fruit swayed in a restless rhythm, tugging at their silver threads as though testing their hold. The traveler remained in the orchard, lending her hands to the keeper's work. She learned to steady the ladders in the wind, to coil rope so it would not snarl, to walk the stone without loosening the roots beneath her feet. Each dawn brought a new color to the sky, and each dusk lit the fruit in shades that did not have names. One morning, the wind rose early. It came with a voice unlike the low hum she had grown used to, a higher, wilder note that set the silver stems singing. The fruit trembled, their glow deepening, and the air filled with the scent of green water and resin. The keeper stood still, his eyes fixed on the ridge. "It is turning," he said. The traveler felt the change without knowing its meaning. The wind struck the orchard from the opposite direction, bending branches in ways they were not meant to bend. Threads snapped. Fruit drifted free, rising into the air instead of falling to the ground. Dozens lifted at once, each carrying within it a pale seed that caught the light. She watched them scatter upward, some spinning, some gliding straight, until they vanished into the pale sky. The keeper did not move to catch them. His gaze followed the last until it was gone. "They will find other stone," he said. "Other ridges, other winds. We keep what remains." In the days that followed, the orchard grew quieter. Empty stems hung from the branches, and the wind's song returned to its gentler note. The traveler walked the rows, seeing spaces where fruit had once swayed. Yet in those gaps, she felt no loss, only the knowledge that somewhere, unseen, new roots might be taking hold. When she left the plateau at last, the keeper gave her no fruit to carry, only a seed, pale and smooth in her palm. "The wind will know," he said, closing her fingers around it. She descended into the valleys, the orchard shrinking behind her, until it was no more than a shimmer against the sky. In her hand, the seed warmed faintly, as if listening for the wind's next turn. Before the wind of the plateau had faded from thought, another light begins to form, not the glow of fruit, but of blossoms that hold their fire within. In a valley walled with forest, the trees do not bloom in colors, but in pale, translucent pods. When spring comes, they shine from within, like lanterns hung by careful hands, and their light moves through the night like water. The Lantern Trees. Chapter 1. The First Bloom. The valley lay in shadow for most of the year, the sun cresting its high ridges only at midday. Snow lingered longest here, melting in thin rivulets that darkened the moss along the stream. But when the first warmth returned, the lantern trees began to wake. Their buds formed quietly, swelling along the branches until the weight of them bent each limb toward the earth. At first they were a dull ivory, opaque in the half-light beneath the forest canopy. Then, one by one, they thinned to translucence, revealing a soft glow deep within. The light was steady, without flicker, warm enough to stain the air with the scent of rain-washed bark. Villagers came at dusk to walk among them, though no one spoke above a murmur. The pods hung at every height, some brushing against shoulders, others swaying far overhead. Children held their hands out beneath them, letting the light gather in their palms. A woman named Istra had tended the grove since her youth. She carried a small knife of bone, used only to cut the pods from the branches when their light began to fade. These she took back to the village, where they were hung in doorways and windows to keep the night at bay. That spring, as she walked the grove, she noticed a change. The pods glowed more strongly than in years past, and their light seemed to linger in the air even after she passed. More than once she turned, thinking someone followed, only to find the path empty. On the night of the first full bloom, the valley shone from ridge to ridge. The stream ran silver between the roots, and every branch bowed under the weight of its lanterns. Istra stood at the grove's heart, the knife warm in her hand, listening to a sound she had never heard before, a faint, low hum, as if the light itself had found a voice. Chapter 2. The Humming Light. The hum was not loud, yet it threaded through every sound in the grove. It lay beneath the stream's rush and the sigh of wind, a constant, even tone that seemed to rise from the lanterns themselves. Istra stood still among the branches, her breath shallow, the knife heavy in her palm. The villagers, too, heard it. Those who had come to walk the grove paused on the paths, lantern light drifting over their faces. Some turned toward the sound as if it came from far away, though others looked down, startled by the vibration they felt beneath their feet. The roots seemed to be carrying the hum through the earth. Istra moved slowly along the path, touching one of the lower pods. Its surface was warm, and the hum grew clearer through her fingertips. Not a single tone, she realized, but many, layered so closely together they became one. She held her hand there until the glow seemed to deepen around her palm. That night, the villagers lingered long past the hour they usually departed. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms, lit by the gentle blaze overhead. No one wished to break the hum with words. Even the stream seemed to run more quietly, as if it too listened. When the moon rose, the light of the lanterns shifted. It was not dimmer, but different. a cooler shade, silver overtaking the gold. The hum followed, lowering in pitch until it was felt more than heard. Istra knelt by the largest tree, pressing her ear against its trunk. She could feel the vibration running upward into the branches, and she thought, for the first time, that the light was not merely filling the pods, but moving through them, traveling from one to the next in a slow, unbroken circuit. As the night deepened, the villagers began to drift away, their paths lit all the way to the valley's edge by the hanging glow. Istra stayed, moving from tree to tree, listening. The hum pulsed faintly in her chest now, echoing her heartbeat. By the time she returned to her small hut at the grove's edge, the sensation had not faded. She lay awake, the hum still within her, and wondered whether it would be there when morning came. Chapter 3. When the pod's full morning brought a pale mist that clung low among the roots, veiling the lower branches in white. The hum was still there, soft but constant, threading through the quiet like a hidden current. Istra stepped from her hut and into the grove, her breath mingling with the mist. The light in the pods had faded to its daytime dimness, the translucent skins holding only the faintest glow, yet she could sense something gathering within them. The day passed slowly. Villagers came and went, their voices hushed, their baskets set aside as they walked, without taking a single pod. The hum grew stronger as the sun crossed its zenith, and by mid-afternoon it was felt in the soles of the feet as much as heard. Even the birds seemed unsettled, their calls sharp before they fell silent altogether. Istra noticed the first pod to loosen. It swayed harder than the rest, silver threads straining, until with a soft tear it fell, landing in the moss without a sound. The light within it flared once, and then held steady. She bent to lift it, but before her hand reached, the pods split along a hidden seam. From within rose a faint ribbon of light, coiling upward into the air before vanishing into the canopy. The husk in her hand was warm, then cooling quickly. More pods began to drop. Some landed in the stream and drifted away, glowing faintly beneath the water's surface until they dissolved into pale motes. Others opened as they touched the ground, releasing threads of light that slipped away between the trees. The hum deepened with each release, the air vibrating until it seemed the grove itself was breathing. As dusk fell, the falling quickened. Istra moved among the trees, her knife forgotten at her side, watching the lanterns loosen and descend. Villagers gathered, standing in small groups as the ground became strewn with opened husks, each empty and paper-thin. No one spoke, all watched the light leaving the grove in small, steady streams. By night, nearly every branch was bare. The last few pods hung high, their glow intense against the darkness. When they fell, their light lingered longest, pooling at the base of the trunks before slipping away into the earth. The hum rose to its highest pitch, then stopped all at once, leaving only the sound of the stream. The grove stood in shadow. Without the lanterns, the trees seemed taller, their branches stark against the stars. The villagers turned homeward, their paths dim now but for the moon's thin light. Istra remained where she stood, the cool husk of the final pod in her palm. She knew the lanterns would return in spring, but the hum, she thought, might not. And in its absence, the valley would remember the night when the light unbound itself and went walking into the dark. By morning, the air was sharper, and the mist above the stream no longer rose freely but clung low, edged with the first threads of frost. Along the banks, fallen leaves lay rimmed in silver, and the days shortened enough that dusk now reached the water's edge before the sun had cleared the far ridge. In another valley, far from the lantern grove, a pond lay still beneath the turning sky, its surface waiting for night to draw another kind of light. Before the last glimmer of the lanterns faded from thought, The path led inward through birch and moss to a hollow where sound grew careful. There, the ground cupped a pool so clear that it carried the day's sky without blur. At noon, clouds drifted across it, as if laid upon glass. At evening, the pale arc of the moon rested unbroken on its surface. Yet when night truly came, the sky within the water was not the sky above. The Glass Pond. Chapter 1. The Night Reflection. The clearing breathed a cold that was not cruel. Birch trunks rose like pale columns, their thin bark peeling in curls that caught the light. The moss between them kept a softness underfoot even in frost. In the middle lay the pond, round and still, with edges so exact that one might have thought it carved rather than shaped by rain and earth. By day it was a mirror of what the eyes already knew. Leaves leaned over and were returned to themselves, a little brighter for being seen twice. Dragonflies skated and became their own shadows. When wind crossed the hollow, the pond did not ruffle. The air's hand laid itself upon the surface and found no purchase. The water only thickened its brightness, as if refusal itself could be luminous. At dusk a man came down the slope, moving more slowly than he once had. Dar kept a small house beyond the birch line and brought his work to the clearing when evening ran long. He carried a bundle of willow cuttings tied with cord and a knife with a handle worn to the shape of his palm. He sat upon a root and began the quiet craft of stripping bark, laying pale lengths of willow on the moss beside him. He did not come to the pond for marvels. There were days when the mind grew tight as a clenched fist, and the work of his hands loosened it. Yet he had learned, over seasons, that the pond kept a steadiness that answered his own. The thought of it was enough to ease his breath on hard mornings, and the sight of it set the house's silence in order when the door closed behind him at night. Twilight drew its thin blue over the birches. The last birds crossed the clearing. Dara wiped the knife, set it aside, and lifted his eyes to the water. The first star pricked the sky above, and at once the pond showed stars of its own. Not the scattered handful the evening yet allowed, but a sweep of constellations unknown to his eye. They lay upon the water as if pressed there, sharp as frost, bright as a winter field under moon. He had seen this before, but still the sight took his breath. The sky within the pond was darker and deeper than the sky above, its stars arranged in patterns that had never stood over his house. A long curve of lights, feathered at one edge, reached from rim to rim as if the pond's own arch were echoed within. Near the center burned 3 steady points, set in a triangle so exact it could have been drawn with ruler and string. Around them a mist of finer lights lay like pollen caught in air. Dara leaned forward until the chill of the water touched his breath. The birches were not reflected here now. His face, when he sought it, did not look back. It was not a trick of shadow. There were nights when thin cloud hid the real stars, and the pond still held its alien firmament. There were nights of clear frost when the sky above weighed on the lungs with its brightness, and the pond kept its own chart, calm and entire, untroubled by what shone overhead. Footsteps sounded in the leaves. A girl came into the clearing with her shawl wrapped close and her hair unbound. She was of the village below the ridge, one Dara had seen in passing at the well, though he could not place her name. She stopped a short distance from the rim and stood with hands folded, looking not up but down. "You came to see it," Dara said softly. She nodded, and the lamplight she carried laid a small gold upon the trunks. "My brother spoke of it," she answered. "He said, 'The water remembers a sky it has no right to know.' No one has told it what it may keep," Dara said. "Sit. Do not bring the lamp too near." She set the lamp behind a root and drew her shawl tighter. The night had laid its weight upon the clearing. The pond shone with that other heaven, so exact that the mind began to build distance above it. One felt the urge to tip forward and fall, not downward but outward, as if the water were a door swung open to a high, dark room. They did not speak for a time. The three-pointed triangle burned steady. A faint thread, barely more than a suspicion of light, ran between two low clusters like a drawn bow. Near the rim, where a leaf might have broken the surface by day, a blur of brightness gathered and thinned in a slow rhythm. It did not move like cloud. It did not move like anything the eye could name. "My brother dreamed he was walking there," the girl said at last, her voice low and even. "He said the ground underfoot was smooth as slate and cold through the soles." He woke with the shape of that cold in his feet. The feeling did not leave until noon. Dara's hand settled on the willow rods. "There are others who have said such things." She watched the pond without blinking. "He left a week ago to look for work along the river. I told him if the road took him near he should stop and look again." The word again lay between them for a breath. Dara did not ask whether the brother had spoken of the pond in the day or only in sleep. The birches creaked high on their white trunks. Somewhere in the hollow, a fox's foot pressed the moss and found no sound. "Do you fear it?" she asked. "No," he answered. "I keep the fear for other things." She drew a long breath. "Then tell me what you see, the way you would tell it to a blind woman." Dari considered. Words had a way of making such sights smaller. Yet silence would not serve her. He spoke as if measuring each phrase with his knife. "I see a curve from one side to the other," he said, "not like our rivers bend, but like the path of a bird that knows the shape of wind. I see 3 lights set in a triangle, sharp enough to set a cup upon. Between 2 clusters there is a thread so faint it could be the hair of a child. And there is a place near the edge where brightness gathers as if breath fogged a pane, and then clears again." She listened with her head slightly turned, as if taking the words into another sense. "I see them now," she said. "They are as you say." Dari did not tell her that on some nights the triangle shifted a finger's width, and that the curve breathed nearer to the rim and then away again, in a rhythm too slow for the hours that marked an evening. There were changes one learned to witness without expecting rule. The lamp's small gold thinned as its oil failed. The cold grew more present in the hollow. Frost began to write its pale script upon the moss where breath had dampened it. Dari gathered his willow and rose. "I will come again tomorrow," the girl said. "The pond will be here," he answered. She lifted the lamp and cupped its weak flame with her palm. The clearing folded around her as she went, the birches taking her into their thin white line. When her steps had gone to silence, Dar stood alone a moment longer. The other sky lay open before him, untroubled by his looking. He felt no summons, only the steadiness that had first brought him down the slope in the old years. He bowed his head, as if one might greet a room that keeps faith with itself. And then he, too, turned toward home. On his journey up the dimly lit path, the tranquil pond stood still, as chill and sharp as a polished blade under the winter's starlight. Above it, the common stars assumed their positions, oblivious to the scene below. In its depths, untouched by any breeze, an alternative winter raged, devoid of any fallen leaves. The following evening arrived with a crisp clarity, leaving no room for fogginess. The birches stood high and clean against a sky the color of pale iron. Frost lay in the seams of the moss like ash sifted thin. Dara's breath drifted in a straight line as he came down the slope, his bundle of willow light upon his shoulder. The girl was already there. She had set her lamp at a distance and folded her shawl beneath her to keep the damp from her dress. Her hands were empty. She did not look away from the pond when he entered the clearing. "I did not sleep," she said, "or I slept and did not know it. Either way, I woke with the cold in my feet all the same." Dar placed the willow by the root and sat. "Tell me where it held you." "In the arch between the 3 steady lights," she answered. "There was a path there in my dream, though I could not see it with my eyes. It announced itself through the soles of my feet. The cold made the shape." They watched as the first star opened above the birches. At once the pond answered with its other sky. The triangle burned where it had burned before. The long curve feathered itself and stretched as if it were a wing at rest, and then half opened. Between low clusters, the faint thread brightened to a mark that the eye could keep. A pair of villagers came and paused at the rim, hats in hand, the hush of the clearing settling upon their shoulders. A child with them held a twig and laid it upon the water. It did not sink. It did not drift. It did not mar the surface in any way. After a quiet breath, the man took the twig back and touched it to his own lips, as if to be certain it had not turned to something else. Dara unbound the willow and worked without speaking. Bark lifted under his knife in long, pale curls. The sound of it was soft as skin against linen. Beside him, the girl folded her hands together to keep the ache out of them. The cold carried a steadiness that reached the bones. "Once," Dari said after a time, "a woman came with a length of spun flax and a pin. She set the pin in the flax and held the free end in her hand. She lowered the pin until it touched the pond and then let go. In our world, the flax fell slack. In the pond's sky, it drew straight as if a weight took it." "What became of the pin?" the girl asked. "It lay there, bright as a grain of salt upon slate. We watched until our eyes smarted. We could not say whether it was the same pin, or whether the act of letting go had made it a different thing that only looked like the first. In the morning there was nothing to see but water and the whitened stems of birch." The girl drew her shawl close, though the air was still. "Why do none of you fear this?" "We fear," Dara said. "We have learned to fear in silence, so the fear does not multiply itself." From the rim near the girl's knee, a moth lifted, pale and slow. It wandered above the surface and then, in a drift that seemed unchosen, settled. It did not touch the water. It touched the other sky. For a breath it glowed as if lit from beneath. Then it rose again, leaving nothing behind, not wing mark, not ripple, not dust. It circled once and vanished into the darker part of the trees. The child, grown restless, tugged at the villager's sleeve. They bowed their heads to the pond, as one might bow to a doorway when one cannot see what sits within, and took the path out of the clearing. "Your brother," Dara said. "Tell me his name," Ren, she answered. "How long did he watch the pond before he dreamed of walking there?" "Twice," she said. "The first time he laughed. The second, he did not." Dara's knife paused. "When some of us first came, we spoke as he did. Then we learned that laughter is a way to make a thing smaller, so that we may carry it. This is not meant to be carried. It is meant to be stood beside." Wind passed over the birches without touching the water. The pond deepened, or seemed to. The stars within it grew a shade colder, a shade more exact. The faint thread between the 2 low clusters brightened further until it held like a spun wire. Along it, at intervals so regular the heart tried to make a rhythm, a series of points began to kindle and fade, as if some patient hand lit lanterns along an invisible way. Dara and the girl leaned forward at the same moment. No sound came with the lights. No ripple broke the perfect plane. Yet something crossed there, keeping to that line. It did not declare itself by body or outline, only by the order of the lights, which woke and slept, as if marking the passage of feet. The girl pressed her fingers to her shoes. The cold she had carried all day now drew sharp along the ball and heel, as if answering a call. "Do you see a figure?" she asked. "I see a will," Derry said. "It has the measure of distance and keeps to it." A single birch leaf, loosened late in the season, let go of its stem and drifted down. It hesitated in a current that did not register upon the skin. When it reached the pond, it did not become a leaf upon water. It became a dark ship against the other stars. It slid a hand's breadth along the feathered curve, and then was nothing. "How far can a person go there?" the girl said, speaking as if not to break the thought. "As far as the pond is deep," he answered, "and the pond is not deep." A long silence followed, in which both of them weighed the answer and found that it meant more than it had said. "Depth is a measure of trust, not of water," he added, almost to himself. Footsteps again. This time, the old woman from the east slope entered, walking with a stick that had polished itself to her hand over years. She sat without greeting, faced the pond a long time, and then spoke as if speaking to the water. "My husband stood here the year the cranes nested near the reed bed," she said. "He was a man who believed what he could mend with his hands. He watched in silence and went home different. For a month he stepped out of bed as if the floor might not be there. Then it passed. A year later he died of the fever that took many. But that month was the nearest I have ever seen him to joy." No one answered. They did not need to. The night held their words and returned them changed only by the weight of being heard. The triangle shifted the smallest degree toward the birch on the far side. Dar felt, as he sometimes did, that the pond's sky was not a single scene, but an hour in some other place. The hour moved. If one returned often enough, one might watch a season come and go upon that surface, while the ground of the clearing kept its own winter and spring. "Wren will come back," the girl said quietly, either promise or plea. "Then bring him to sit," the old woman said. "Bring him to listen with the soles of his feet." A fox cried once far off, thin and bright. The pond did not answer. It kept its heaven. The ordered lights along the faint wire flared and dimmed once more, and then went dark, as if whatever had crossed had reached an end we could not see. The breath of the three of them settled into a single slow rhythm, like the hush at a bedside where a child has at last fallen asleep. The oil in the girl's lamp fell low again. She rose and turned to go, but before she took the first step she knelt and pressed both hands flat to the moss. When she stood, her palms were damp and colder than the air, as if the chill of the slate within the pond had reached up into the ground and touched her. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Derry answered. After they had gone, the old woman remained a while. She did not watch the stars in the water. She watched the rim, the narrow ring where Earth met that unbroken plain. The care with which the meeting held seemed to her the gentlest part of the wonder, that two worlds could touch so closely and not disturb each other. At last she, too, rose and took the path through the birches, her stick finding the soft places without looking. When the clearing was empty, the pond's other sky burned on, whole and entire. A thin fog formed along the low ground and did not cross the pond's edge. Frost gathered its brightness on the moss. Somewhere, far beyond the ridge, cranes slept with their heads beneath their wings. Here, the three steady lights kept their watch. The faint wire lay unlit, a road with no traveler. And beneath the soles of anyone who might come at dawn, the earth kept the shape of a cold it did not make. Chapter 3. The Crossing. The third night brought wind from the north, carrying a scent of snow, though no flakes yet fell. The birches bent in long sighs, their tops shifting against the dark. Dari made the descent with care, the path already slick where frost had glazed the moss. In the hollow, the pond lay untouched, its rim a perfect ring of pale ground where no drift ever formed. The girl waited again, her lamp set well back. Tonight she had brought no shawl, though the cold was sharper. Her hands rested on her knees, palms upward, as if waiting to receive. "I dreamed of the triangle," she said as he joined her. "But this time, I was beneath it. The stars there were larger. I could see space between them. The pond was already lit with its other sky. The triangle burned steady, the feathered arc spread wide. Tonight, the faint thread between the low clusters glimmered before the real stars had claimed their place overhead. Dare laid down his willow and said nothing. A silence of that kind had its own welcome here. The girl leaned forward, and he followed her gaze. A figure moved along the faint thread, not the suggestion of passage from the night before, but a visible shape, not in form, but in absence. Where it stepped, the stars within the pond dimmed, as if shadow walked over them. Each step was measured, and at every pause the points along the thread flared, and then fell quiet again. The girl's breath caught. "Ren," she whispered. Dara's eyes did not leave the shadow. "You cannot know." "I know," she said. The figure paused at the triangle's center. For a moment the three lights dimmed in unison, as if the stars themselves were listening. Then the shadow stepped forward again, toward the far rim. Without seeming to choose, the girl removed her shoes. The cold of the ground bit sharp into her feet, but she did not flinch. She rose, and Dare stood with her. "You must not," he said quietly. "I must see," she answered. She stepped to the rim and lowered one foot toward the surface. The water did not receive it. The pond's own sky received it. Where her toes touched, the stars bowed away, leaving a dark print that matched her shape exactly. For one heartbeat she stood between worlds, her other foot still on moss. Then she shifted her weight and was upon the pond entirely. The print of her first step glowed faintly and faded. She followed the thread. The shadow ahead did not turn, but its pace altered, slowing as if aware of her presence. The points between the clusters lit for them both. Two sets of lights marking two passages. From the moss, Dari watched, his hands at his sides. The air in the clearing grew heavy, pressing against the chest like the moment before a storm breaks. When they reached the triangle's center, the girl stopped. The shadow stopped with her. She stood with her head tilted back, as if looking at a sky beyond the one she walked. Then, without a gesture, the shadow moved again, and she followed. They reached the far rim. The shadow crossed. She stepped after it, and was gone. The pond's sky held still for a long breath. Then the points along the thread dimmed one by one, and the triangle burned alone. Dari waited. The wind moved through the birches, but the pond gave no sign. When at last the triangle dimmed and the pond's surface mirrored the real sky once more, he turned toward the path. He did not take the willow bundle. His hands were empty, and his steps were slow. Behind him the pond lay as it always had, keeping the depth it chose. Somewhere in its slate-cold heaven, two figures walked where no frost could touch them, and the earth beneath Dari's feet held the memory of their passing. Before the image of the glass pond could fade, the mind turned seaward to a place where salt winds cut through the night and the waves carry voices no one calls. Along the shore of a fishing village, there is a lantern made not of wood or brass, but of bone bleached by years of tide and sun. It burns each night without fail, for when its light dies, the sea brings in things that do not belong to its nets. The Weaver at the End of the Field, Chapter 1, The Loom House. The house was smaller than a barn and larger than a hut, with a roof of weathered thatch and walls that had taken on the color of the nearby soil. Nettles kept the doorway, and a path of flattened rye straw ran to it like a tongue. The windows were deep and narrow, set to hold light without inviting eyes. Those who passed that way seldom did so twice by chance. Children crossed to the far side of the lane and walked in the ditch rather than risk the stretch of wall beneath which the loom's rhythm could be felt like a pulse through stone. The old men of the village said the woman within took no coin for her cloth, for what she sold was not meant to be worn. It was meant to be used in other ways. A trader came one late afternoon in the gold hour before dusk, when the wheat heads glowed and the shadows of swallows ran long over the fields. He was not young. His coat showed repairs done with care, and his pack sat on his back as if it had learned the shape of his shoulders. He walked the straw path and stood at the threshold listening. The loom kept its pace, a draw that was like breath, a pause that was like listening, a return that was like the hand laid down upon the heart. Between those motions lay the faint sound of thread passing through thread, soft as hair through fingers. He knocked once upon the wood. The rhythm within did not falter. After a time a voice said, "Enter." And he did. The room was cool, the air scented with flax and the dust of dry stalks. Light fell in 2 long bars from the narrow windows, laying ladders across the packed earth floor. In the far half, the loom stood like a timbered beast, uprights thick as a man's leg, beams blackened by years of oil, heddles hanging in ranks that caught and released the light. The weaver sat straight-backed upon her bench. Her hair was bound in a plain coil at the crown of her head, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her feet finding the treadles without looking. She did not glance up at once. The shuttle moved in her hand as if by its own will, finding the shed, crossing, returning. Only when a length the width of a hand had grown did she lift her eyes to the man and incline her head. "You have come to buy or to ask?" she said. "To commission," he answered, though the word seemed too fine for his plain coat and pack. "If you will take the work, what should it be?" "A garment," he said, and then the pause lengthened until it became an admission. "One that makes me less visible to those who seek me." The weaver's hands did not leave the shuttle. The loom's breath did not change. "You have enemies. I have those who believe I have something that belongs to them," he said. His eyes flicked once toward the pack, as if the thing in question lay there. "I am weary of being known by men whose work is taking." "Many are weary of being known," the weaver said. "Fewer understand what is given up when they are not." He let the words settle. Grain whispered against itself beyond the walls. A bee struck the narrow pane and found its way out again. "What price do you ask?" he said at last. "I do not ask coin," she said. "I ask a measure. You will leave me something of yourself to weave into the cloth. What you leave will not return to you unchanged." The man's jaw tightened. "What measure?" "An hour you would choose to lose," she said. "Not a day, not a name, not the shape of your hand. 1 hour only, taken cleanly from your remembering. You will not know which one I have taken until you need it and find only cloth." He swallowed. His hands rose to the strap of his pack and then fell again. "And in exchange, you will be less seen," she said. "Not by all eyes, not at all times. There are limits to what cloth can ask of the world, but in narrow streets, at the edges of crowds, in doorways where men look for a figure to mark and follow, you will be one thread among many." He stood a long while, measuring the offer. In the weaver's steady presence, the stakes of the bargain took their true shape, not a charm, not a trick, but an adjustment of the place where a life met the sight of others. At last he nodded. "Take the hour." The weaver set down the shuttle. She rose and crossed to him, not tall, not small, not young, not old. A woman like the line where field ends and hedge begins. She touched 2 fingers to his forehead and then to his chest. The room cooled. The straw at the threshold rustled and was still. Somewhere a swallow's cry cut short. "Sit," she said. "Close your eyes. When you open them, you will have lost something you will not miss until you do." He sat upon a low stool. His breathing slowed. His head dipped once as if surrendering to the weight of a hand. The weaver returned to the loom. She set a new weft from a basket at her side, pale as unbleached flax and fine as hair. When she took up the shuttle again, its passage through the shed made a new sound. The barest tremor, a thread-fine ringing like the echo of a cup touched by a fingernail. Time moved differently in that room. The light spars crawled across the floor, caught for a while upon a knot in the beam, and then crept on. Outside, children's voices came and went like birds crossing a field. Inside, the cloth grew by the width of a finger, then a hand, then a span. When the weaver spoke, her words rode the loom's rhythm. "Tell me your name." The man opened his eyes and parted his lips, but no word came. He frowned, not in fear but in patient perplexity, as if he had reached into a familiar pocket and found it empty. He looked at the pack, then at his hands, then at the window where sky lay in a long rectangle. "It will trouble you for a time," the weaver said. "Later, in a crowded street, it will trouble those who seek you more." He nodded once, accepting the shape of what was missing without breaking. The weaver lowered her gaze and worked on, and the cloth took the hour into itself, thread by thread, until it lay there as pattern and not as memory. As dusk drew down, the trader rose. He stood in the doorway with his hand upon the lintel and looked back. "How long?" he asked. "When the last field turns and the crows begin to follow the plough," she said. "Come then." He stepped into the wheat's whisper. The path closed behind him, as paths do when evening takes them. As night gave way to dawn, the loom house maintained its steady beat, and in the skilled weaver's hands, the fabric that would transform a man into someone more respected by his peers began to take on a tranquil form. In Chapter 2, The Measure Taken, the sun rose, painting a thin line of light along the hedge as the trader awoke beneath the comforting shelter of his own roof. He had no recollection of leaving the loom house, though the dust of the field lay on his boots and the strap of his pack had marked his shoulder. On the table stood a cup he did not remember pouring, and beside it a sprig of black thorn blossom, white as milk with a heart the color of bruised sky. He lifted the sprig and set it upon the mantel, unsure why the gesture felt like an answer. The house held quiet. From the road, the slow creak of a cart passed and faded. In that new silence, the absence of his name made itself known again, not as a gap, but as a smooth place where once there had been a knot. A hand might pass there without catching. The mind might do the same. He went to market as he always did on the day assigned him by his own long habit. The square filled, slowly at first, then with the crowd's tide that is part feet and part voices, and part the smell of fruit cut for tasting. He took his corner beside the baker's stall and unrolled his cloth. Lengths of linen plain, woven and sound, thread counted, edges hemmed, the work of a patient man. Faces moved past him, familiar, unfamiliar, their eyes sliding over his wares and sometimes over the man who kept them. He kept his voice low and his posture unthreatening, as all traders learn. By noon he had sold enough to buy oil and salt and a heel of the baker's second loaf. He spoke with 3 women, 2 men, a boy who asked the price of a scrap for a kite. No one asked his name. No one offered theirs in exchange. He felt an ease there, a lightness in the place where friction had often lived. Yet now and then, when a glance should have met his and did not, a thin ache passed through him, as when a muscle long used is not called upon and remembers itself by pain alone. In the afternoon, a pair of men came to the square wearing coats of the city. They did not wear swords, for this was not a village that called for such, but the set of their shoulders said they were used to moving others from their path. They bore the look of men who follow not a road, but a list of names. They walked the market in an order that was not the market's own. They spoke little. Their eyes went where their work taught them to look. Corners where men stand outside the flow, places where the press thins and leaves a figure, doorways that hold a shadow longer than the sun would ask. The trader watched their pattern without appearing to watch. When they came abreast of his stall, one of them looked, and then the look slid. It lost him. It found the baker's boy behind him, and then it moved on. The second man's gaze followed. It caught the edge of the trader's coat, as wind might catch a hanging cloth, and then pass through it without a handhold. The trader set his palm upon the table to keep it from rising. His heart kept its measure, one beat too slow. "Have you seen a fellow with a scar along the jaw?" one of the men asked the baker, carrying a pack patched with a dark square at the corner. "I have seen a dozen packs patched with squares," the baker answered, not unkind. He lifted a loaf and set it down. "Men carry their lives in such. Would you like a heel?" The men declined and moved on. Their gaze crossed the trader again and took nothing from him. He let out the breath he had not admitted he was holding, and for a time he did not lift his eyes from the plain weave before him, as if the threads there could steady what had shifted in his place among others. He sold out by evening, which had happened before and would happen again, and yet it felt different. Not triumph, not relief, but a sense of having walked through a door that others failed to notice, though it stood in the open. He folded his empty cloth, lifted his pack, and took the road past the fields. At the bend where the hedgerow gives way to the path of rye straw, he paused. The wind moved in the tall grass with the sound that had called him the day before. Threads stretched between the high stakes shivered without breaking. The cottage door stood open, the loom's rhythm steady as a pulse. Inside, the weaver worked. The cloth upon the beam had grown. It held shades of late afternoon now. The yellow that edges a cloud when the sun rides low, the grey that gathers under eaves before rain, the thin blue that remains after brightness leaves. She did not look up when he entered. She set the shuttle through the shed and drew it back, her feet finding the treadles in a sequence that spoke of years beyond counting. "You have walked the market," she said. "I have," he answered. "There were men who looked for a man with my pack. They did not find me." The weaver inclined her head a degree that admitted neither pride nor surprise. Cloth can teach the eye to pass by what the mind once gathered greedily. You will find that it does so best when you ask little of it. If you cling to its work, it will resent the hold. He set his folded lengths upon the table and sat upon the low stool. "There is a cost," he said. "I feel it." "There is always a cost," she replied. "Listen to it while it is still willing to speak to you." He was quiet, and in that quiet he found the shape of the ache. "When I reached for my name this morning, the hand of my mind did not catch it," he said. "I did not need it to buy or to sell, but there was a moment when a child looked at me, and the child's gaze tried to know me. It could not. It went on to the next thing. The ache is not fear. It is hunger of a different sort." "You are not the only one who eats," the weaver said. "Those who look feed on what they know. When you give them less, they must learn to live on less. Some starve. Some grow lean and then healthy. The choice is not yours." The loom spoke the small speech of wood and thread. He watched the cloth lengthen, the pattern of the hour he had given himself to losing lying within it, like a grain that runs against the board's long line. "What hour did you take?" he asked at last, though he knew the answer would not be given. "I took the one that would trouble you least in the work you have chosen," she said. "If you seek the seam, you will not find it. If you forget to seek, you will discover it has always been where your fingers now rest." He looked down. His hands lay open upon his knees, palms up as if awaiting weight. He turned them and saw a line of old scars, thin as threads, running crosswise to the life he had made. He could not recall where he had earned them. He guessed he had once known and then chosen to forget, or the forgetting had chosen him. Dusk gathered. Outside, the first bats wrote their narrow letters on the air. The weaver rose and set a trimmed wick in a shallow dish. She did not light it. The room did not need flame, while the loom still held the day. "May I see the garment as it forms?" he asked. "You may watch the cloth," she said. "The garment exists when the cloth agrees to be cut. Until then, it is a field that does not know its harvest." He nodded, and they kept their quiet. In time, the loom paused, not for weariness, but because the weaver's attention shifted. She went to the door and stood in the threshold, listening to the field. "You keep a room that is larger than its walls," he said, "not to flatter, but to name what the body knows when it steps from a road into a place that has been made by older hands." "The field makes the room," she answered. "I only keep the gate." He slept that night on the bench, at the weaver's nod, without blanket, without fire. Cold found him, and then passed through him as if he were a screen and not a stone. He woke before dawn with the sense of having been called by name, and then of not knowing the voice that called. At the grey hour he walked the path to wash his face in the ditch, where clear water kept to the shade. On the way he passed the stakes, and their threads stretched fine between. He reached out a careless hand to pluck one, and thought better of it. As he watched, the thread moved, though the wind lay still, drawing a shallow curve in the air between its anchors. A drop of dew gathered at its lowest point and hung heavy as a small promise. He returned to find the weaver setting a second warp upon a narrower frame. A loom no larger than a man's arm length, brought out from the shadow of the corner. She drew threads across it with a care that belonged to a task not often asked of her. "What is that for?" he said. "For mending what the wind took from your scrap," she said, lowering the heddle with 2 fingers. "It is one thing to make new cloth that shifts the eye's habit. It is another to ask the day to give back a thread it has already learned to carry away." She set the shuttle and drew it across. The sound was different from the larger loom, higher, with a faint ring, as if a small bell far off had been struck once and then again at a distance. He watched as color returned to the pale blue of his mother's lost shawl, not by dye, but by memory coaxed from the day's last light. Where the wind had torn, the mending made a quiet seam. He could not say whether it healed the loss or taught the fabric to live with it. Perhaps those are the same. When the hour came to leave, the weaver stopped her hands and looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered that morning. Her eyes were the color of flax water in a wooden tub, clouded and clear at once. "You will be tempted to spend what you have bought," she said. "You will wish to walk bold where men once marked you and be unseen. Spend little. The cloth grows narrow when asked to do what belongs to courage." He inclined his head, startled by gratitude. "And when you return," she added, "do not come by the road. Come through the field. The gate keeps its own count." He stepped back into the whisper of grain. The blackthorn kept the threshold with its dark thorns and its pale flowers. The wind laid his coat along his back, and then lifted it again as if to test whether cloth or man would be blown away first. That night he slept with the window unlatched. The house took the smell of rye and hedge into its corners. He woke just once, at a time he could not measure, with the sense of a hand upon his shoulder. He said his name, or thought he did, and the air gave no answer. In the morning, there was a single blackthorn petal on the floor beside his bed, not withered, not fresh, the kind of white that remembers the last light of evening and does not surrender it at once. On the 3rd day, he walked the road east where the city men had gone. He passed them at a crossroads. Their eyes sought a man the lists told them should be there. He found, in the space between their looking and their seeing, a narrow path that was his alone to take. He walked it without noise and did not hurry. The hour he had given lay in the cloth on the weaver's beam, quiet as a seed. What would grow from it would be his to carry until the field turned and the crows followed the plough. Chapter 3. The Shadow Line. The morning broke under a low sky, the light diffused and without edge. Anara woke to the same steady sound, the loom's breath, the weaver's tread, the shuttle's patient passage. It was colder today. She could see the pale plume of her own breath as she crossed to the table where the cloth lay waiting. The blue was richer now, the sunset threads more pronounced, but running through the whole length was a new element, a thin, dark line that moved like a current beneath water. It was subtle, almost invisible unless the cloth shifted, and then it seemed to draw the eye inward, into some depth beyond the weave. The shadow line, the weaver said without lifting her gaze from the work. Once it is finished, the wind cannot cross it, nor can what the wind has taken. Anara stood beside her, watching the shuttle pass. The dark thread was unlike the others. It caught no light, and its texture was finer than hair. Where does it come from? The weaver's hands did not pause. From hours that are not lived, moments someone turned away from and let slip past. I keep them until they are needed. Anara felt a chill that was not from the cold air. Whose hour is in this cloth? The weaver looked up then, and her eyes were neither young nor old. Yours since yesterday. You gave it when you stepped through the gate. The knowledge sat in Anara like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples slow to reach the edge. She could not name what hour was missing. No gap, no hollow, just the certainty that one moment she might have lived now lay here, stretched between warp and weft. By midday the shadow line was complete. The cloth seemed to settle, the weave tightening as though it had drawn a deep breath and held it. The weaver cut it from the loom with a knife of bone, the sound as soft as grass parting. She laid the finished piece across the table. The frayed scrap of the shawl was gone, absorbed entirely. Anara touched the new fabric. It was warm, though the air was cool. Under her fingers, the shadow line pulsed faintly, like the echo of a heartbeat. "It is yours," the weaver said. "Keep it where the wind cannot find it. Do not wear it in open fields, nor near running water at dusk. And when you look at it in the years ahead, remember that it holds not only what was lost, but what you gave to bind it whole." Anara folded the cloth carefully, the weight of it more than its size could explain. Outside, the grass along the path bowed in a passing gust, but the air inside the cottage was still. When she stepped back through the blackthorn gate, the road seemed both familiar and strange, as though some part of it had shifted in her absence. She glanced once over her shoulder. The path was empty, the bend already hiding the loom house from sight. The wind caught at her hair, but it did not tug. The cloth under her arm held steady, and the shadow line lay quiet within its weave. The Bone Lantern, Chapter 1, The Keeper's Vigil. The harbour lay quiet under the moon, the masts swaying in slow arcs that caught the light like brushstrokes on dark water. Nets hung from the pilings, heavy with the day's salt, their shadows long on the worn planks of the pier. At the far end where the land met the deep channel, the bone lantern burned. Its frame was a lattice of curved ribs, smoothed by hands and sea, bound together by bands of copper gone green with age. Within, the flame shone through the pale bars, casting a strange light that was neither gold nor white, but something caught between. Those who passed near swore the glow did not touch the water, as if the sea refused it. Mara had kept the lantern for 6 winters. She came at dusk with oil and flint, checked the bands for looseness, and lit the flame before the last gulls wheeled in toward the cliffs. Her father had kept it before her, and his mother before him, though none had spoken in detail of why the flame must never fail. The warning was always the same: it is not the dark we keep away, but what walks in it. She had asked once, as a child, what would come if the lantern went out. The answer had been a silence that told her more than words. It was not a threat to be explained. It was a weight one accepted, as fishermen accept the depth of the water and the pull of the current. Tonight the wind was high, and the tide pressed hard against the pilings. Mara leaned into it, her cloak snapping, her hair lifting from her shoulders. She shielded the flame with her body as she checked the oil. Beyond the reach of the lantern's light, the water was darker than any sky she had seen, a darkness that seemed to absorb the stars' reflections instead of returning them. She lingered longer than usual, watching that line where light ended and dark began. The wind carried a sound up from it, not the sharp crack of waves on rock, nor the long hush of water over sand, but a rhythm that did not belong to the sea. It was slow, deliberate, and came in threes, like the pacing of feet too heavy for the pier. Mara straightened. Her hand went to the lantern, steadying it though no wave had touched the piling. The sound came again, closer now, though the water between was empty. She turned her gaze to the horizon, but the mist lay thick, hiding all but the first faint crest of the swell. The lantern burned on, its pale light unwavering. And in that light Mara stayed, as her father had, as her grandmother had, keeping her watch where the land ended and the unseen began. Chapter 2: The Tide's Omen. The morning after brought no wind. The sea lay in long glassy swells that rolled without breaking. Gulls wheeled far out but did not call. The air was heavy, the kind that makes ropes slacken on their hooks and timber smell of salt and pitch. Mara walked the pier with her hands behind her back, studying the tide line. It was higher than it should have been. She found old Tevan mending nets by his boat, and asked him if he had heard the sound in the night. He shook his head without looking up. "Best not to hear what the sea keeps for itself," he said. The lantern was lit. "It was," Mara answered. "It burned all night." Tevan's hands paused over his work. "Then we'll not speak of the rest." But word came without asking. That afternoon, 2 boys ran from the far strand to say that something white had washed ashore by the kelp beds. It was long as a man but narrow, with joints like the legs of a crab, and a head that was only a smooth dome of bone. The tide had left it tangled in weed, and when the weed was cut away, the thing crumbled into shards no thicker than shell. The elders gathered in the meeting hall before dusk. Mara was called in last. The room smelled of salt and smoke, and every face was turned toward her. "You keep the lantern," said Etta, who had been headwoman since Mara was a child. "Tell us if it faltered." "It did not," Mara said. The flame was steady. Etta studied her, eyes pale as winter sky. Then something tested it. "The bones on the strand are the shape of a trying. It will try again." Mara felt the weight of the hall's silence. Outside, the sun slid toward the line of the sea. She thought of the sound she had heard in the dark, the heavy, deliberate pacing that had no place on water. The image of the horizon in the mist stayed with her, a line behind which something waited. That night, she lit the lantern earlier than usual. As the first darkness came over the harbor, she stood beside it with her cloak drawn close, her eyes fixed beyond the edge of its light. The tide ran high, the swell steady. And somewhere beyond sight, in the place where the sea turned from known to unknowable, something moved with the patience of a tide, that has never been turned back. Chapter 3. The Night Without Footing. The third night rose under a sky the color of wet slate. Wind walked the length of the coast with salt on its breath, pushing the swell into long-shouldered hills that leaned toward the harbor and then drew back as if thinking better of it. Nets thudded once against pilings and hung still, heavy as sleeping seals. Mara went down the pier with the oil jar in the crook of her arm and the flint at her belt, her cloak bound tight, her hair braided close to keep from the teeth of the gale. She lit the lantern earlier than habit. Flame took at once, a steady tongue inside the lattice of pale ribs. The copper bands creaked as the frame warmed. The light held its odd color, neither gold nor snow, a hue that seemed to belong to bone itself. She checked each binding as her grandmother had taught her, palm firm, eyes narrow against spray that did not touch her until it had passed the lantern's circle and fallen harmlessly at her feet. For a while there was only wind and water's weight. Then the sea lost its voice. The hush was not silence, but the absence of a sound that had been present since she first learned to walk the pier. The swell kept on, but its noise thinned to a breath. Gulls crossed the mouth of the harbor and did not cry. From beyond the reach of the lantern came the rhythm she had heard 2 nights before, 3 spaced beats that had no right to lie upon water, a tread with no boards to take it. Mara set her hand to the lantern's frame. The bone was warm under her palm. A memory rose without bidding, the night her father had put her small hand where hers rested now. "The frame will tell you before the eye can bear it," he had said. "Keep faith with what your hand knows." The lantern pulsed once against her palm, a subtle tightening like the breath of a living thing. Then the light thinned, not dimming but narrowing, drawing in upon itself until the glow was a core no larger than the heart of her hand. The dark beyond the pier grew thick, as if the water were gathering its folds. Shapes came then, not bodies, not boats, but the suggestion of tall forms that held their place against the tide. They did not break the surface. They made the surface remember them. Between crest and trough, the sea wore the faintest angles, like ribs seen through thin skin. The 3-beat tread grew clearer. It was not approach, it was arrival. Mara breathed through her nose until the air steadied. She uncorked the oil and fed the flame in a thin line, careful as a seamstress feeding thread through a needle's eye. The light swelled, steady as a held note. The forms beyond lifted, paused, and tilted slightly, as if regarding her from a height without eyes. A boy ran down the pier, breath loud in the hush. It was Tevin's youngest, shoulders sharp under his rough shirt, hair flattened by spray. He stopped short of the lantern's circle, eyes wide on the water. "Back," Mara said, not turning her head. "No closer." He obeyed, but did not leave. The pier held his small weight like a hand holds a bird that does not yet know it will be released. Along the line where light met dark, the water began to knit itself into folds. At first they were no more than swells crossing one another. Then they took a regular order, ridges raised, troughs laid out, until the sea wore the look of woven cloth. In the crossing center, a space opened that did not fill. It lay there like a mouth keeping itself shut by choice alone. The lantern's flame leaned. A draught that did not come from wind pressed against it. Mara set her body before the frame and cut the light with both hands, feeling heat pool in her palms. The bone ticked under her fingers as the copper bands settled tighter. The pulse rose along the lattice again, steadier now, as if the lantern were waking to its task. From the woven water, 3 pale lengths rose. They were smooth as drift-worn ivory, jointed in places like the articulations of a hand. No flesh clung to them, no weed trailed. They lifted together to the height of a tall man and held there dripping nothing. The boy behind her made a sound without meaning. his breath pulled thin. Mara did not step back. She raised the lantern by its ring until the light lay directly upon the 3 pale lengths. The glow did not dazzle them. It held them as metal holds a mark. Slowly the lengths withdrew, sinking without ripple. The mouth in the water closed as if it had never been. Wind came back all at once, striking her cloak flat against her ribs. The sea found its voice. Waves spoke in their old tongue along the rocks beyond the point. The boy began to breathe, as a boy should, too fast at first, then slower. "Go," Mara said without turning. "Tell Etta the light holds. Tell your father to keep the boats high. The tide will forget itself before dawn." He ran, feet hammering the planks in a rhythm that belonged to land and not to what waits outside it. When his steps had gone to the far dark, Mara set the lantern back in its place and wiped salt from her lips with the back of her wrist. The night did not release her yet. The forms in the mist did not gather again, but something else came on the water. A long, slow undulation that arrived from the open and did not stop at the mouth of the harbor. It passed beneath the pier without lifting a board, without stirring a rope end, and went on toward the inner shore. In its wake, the light upon the lantern's frame altered. Small shapes took to the glow. Not sparks, not embers, but motes like pale scales. They rose within the lattice, turning slowly as if read by an invisible current. Mara remembered a story Etta had told when she took the keeper's ring, that the lantern was made from the ribs of a creature found stranded in a season when men did not yet name their nets. The bones had been hollow, and when wind blew through them, the sound had carried far over water, calling the boats in from a fog that had lost itself. They had bound those ribs into a frame and set a flame within, and since then the sea had kept to its side of the bargain, so long as the light stood. The motes in the lantern thickened, turning like snow in a globe, before settling upon the inner surfaces of the bone. Where they landed, they burned with a cold fire, and the flame answered, brightening until the ribs themselves took on a faint inner glow. The light now was of 2 kinds, the living fire and the bone remembering its own old brightness. Out beyond, the sea came level as a floor. Something broad moved just beneath, showing not surface but intention. The 3-beat tread sounded again, not approaching this time but passing. A sound carried along a body that did not choose to be seen. Mara set the oil aside. She understood then that the keeping was not only in feeding the flame. It was in standing where one should stand, for as long as it took the sea to recognize its limits. She leaned her shoulder to the post and kept her hands on the frame, feeling the faint tremor of the bone's remembered light through the copper and into her bones. Hours slid by without measure. Once a net rose beside the pier, though no line pulled it, lifted by hands that were not there. It hovered, beads of water bright on its cords as stars, then fell back into the harbor on the landward side. Once a boat's bow nudged the piling with the gentleness of a sleeping animal's breath, though its rope lay slack on the plank. Each time, the lantern's light steadied, and the half-thing that had been invited withdrew, as if ashamed of its own tentative reach. Near dawn, the mist thinned. Cold found every seam in Mara's clothes, and sat there like stitchwork. The flame kept its height. The ribs kept their pale remembering. Out past the channel, the sea lost the last of its woven order and went back to rough cloth with an honest weft. Etta came down the pier with a shawl over her head and a coil of line at her hip. She stopped within the circle of light and stood with Mara, shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the place where shapes had stood. "What asked to come?" she said at last. "Not hunger," Mara answered. "Hunger has a quickness to it. This had patience. It would have learned our houses one board at a time." Etta nodded once. "Then you kept the first board?" She looked at the lantern and laid her knuckles lightly against a rib, as one might greet an old friend who does not sleep. Did it speak? In its way, Mara said. It reminded me that we only borrow the edge of the sea. The rest belongs to what can stand upon water without making a sound. They waited while the light grew at the horizon, a slow lifting of pewter to grey, grey to a thin iron blue. Birds began their work again. First one cry, then many. Ropes creaked with honest weight. The harbour woke as if from a clean sleep. When the first true ray of sun struck the lantern, the motes within its ribs winked out all at once, leaving the bone pale and simple again. Mara closed the oil and settled the cover over the flame to ease it down. Smoke curled, thin as thread, and drifted seaward. The lantern cooled beneath her hands. Copper ticked as it lost its heat. She did not let go until the last warmth left the ribs. On the far strand, the boys later found a coil of sea rope, washed up in a knot. None of them could untie, although it had only 3 turns and a simple bite. Old Tevan spat, and said the water sometimes ties what men should not unfasten. The knot was thrown back, and the tide took it with a haste that did not belong to tides. No more pale bones came ashore. No more nets lifted themselves where there were no hands. That evening, Mara walked to the harbour again. She lit the lantern at the hour her father had taught her, neither early with fear nor late with pride. The frame warmed under her palm. The light took and widened. The sea kept its old voice. She looked to the line where light ends and dark begins, and found that it lay where it should. She could not say what the bone remembered, only that it remembered enough. And if on some nights the tread of 3 slow steps rose faint from far beyond the mouth of the harbour, she set her hand to the ribs and stood where keepers stand until the sound passed on. The bargain held, and the village slept. Before the sea's hush had fully left the ears, the sound of wind in wheat rose in its place. A dry, patient whisper that runs along the land as the tide runs along the shore. Beyond the last cottages, where fields meet a narrow strip of wild hedge, there stands a low house of stone and lime. No smoke rises from its chimney in summer. No lantern hangs at its eaves. Yet by day and by night alike, a faint rhythm comes from within, the measured pull and return of a loom at work. The house that stood for no one, Chapter 1, the room with the tall windows. The first thing Raylan saw was the light, thin and grey, slanting down from windows higher than any he remembered. It painted the dust in the air into slow-falling threads. He sat up on a narrow bed with a coverlet, the colour of lichen, his boots standing side by side on the bare floorboards. They were dry, though he remembered walking in rain. The room was spare. A tall wardrobe with no key in its lock, a table against the wall, a chair that faced not the bed but the door. The wood beneath him was warm, as if the sun had long rested there, though the air was cool. He crossed to the windows. They reached almost to the ceiling, their glass wavery and thick. Beyond them, the clearing stretched to a line of dark trees. The grass there was unbent by wind, as if the air itself had chosen stillness. When he turned back, the chair by the door was occupied. It was a woman, or the shape of one, her face in shadow, her hands folded upon her lap. She spoke in a voice like paper drawn across wood. "You have come far." "I don't remember coming at all," Raylan said. Her head tilted as though the answer satisfied her. "That is well. The house does not keep what is already claimed elsewhere." He took a step toward her, but the door behind her opened of its own accord. The hall beyond was dim, lit only by narrow windows high in the walls. She rose and passed through without sound. After a moment he followed. The hall bent left, then right, then seemed to straighten, though the same tall windows appeared on both sides. Doors stood ajar, revealing rooms both empty and furnished, a dining hall with plates laid but no food, a study whose books had no titles on their spines, a small parlor where the fire burned low without smoke. Each time he looked back, the hall behind him was different, sometimes longer, sometimes with fewer doors. The air smelled of wood smoke in one breath, rain in the next. The woman waited at the top of a narrow stair. "You may walk where you will," she said. "The house will keep you until you are ready to leave." "And when will that be?" Her eyes met his then, pale and clear as water over stone. "When the house no longer knows your name." She turned and descended. Rollins stood a moment longer, feeling the grain of the rail beneath his hand, warm as if many had paused there before him. Below, the stair curved out of sight. Somewhere in the walls, a faint rhythm began, like breathing or the slow settling of timbers. He could not tell if it came from the house or from himself. Chapter 2. The Mirror Room. Raylan followed the sound of his own steps through the winding halls, though each footfall seemed to lose some part of itself before it reached his ears. The house was not silent. It was listening. The windows grew fewer, then vanished entirely, and the air cooled as if sunlight had been locked out of this wing for longer than he had lived. A door stood half open on the left. Beyond it, the light was dim but without shadow, a steady wash that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The room was long, its walls paneled in dark wood worn smooth with age. Between each panel hung a tall mirror framed in pale wood that glowed faintly in the unplaceable light. The first mirror showed the hallway behind him, but his own body was absent. The second reflected the same hall, except its doors were in the wrong places, some narrower, others taller than he had seen. In the third, he saw the clearing outside the tall windows, even though this room lay far from the outer wall. He stepped inside. The boards underfoot gave a soft complaint, then stilled. The air carried the scent of rain on stone, though he had passed no open door. He moved from mirror to mirror, searching for one that might return his own face. None did. In some, the hallway stood empty, but for a pale shape far down its length. In others, the clearing's grass bent under a wind he could not feel. One mirror showed a narrow bed with a lichen-colored coverlet, as if he were looking back into the room where he had woken. Except the bed was neatly made, and there were no boots on the floor. At the far end of the room stood a single chair. On the seat lay a folded length of grey cloth, fine enough to pass through a ring, yet heavy enough that it had settled into the wood like a stone in wet sand. He reached out, and the moment his fingers touched it, a faint shiver ran up his arm, as though the fabric remembered being held tightly by another for a long time. "You may take it," said a voice behind him. He turned. The woman from the first room stood in the doorway. The mirrors on either side of her showed only the doorframe and the wall, not her shape. "What is it?" he asked. "A key," she said, "not to a door. To a way the house might choose to open." He lifted the cloth. It seemed heavier than its weave should allow, its folds holding a slow warmth that was not his own. "And if I do not take it, then the house will keep it until another wakes who might use it. What am I meant to open?" Her gaze shifted past him to the farthest mirror. "When you see yourself, you will know the way. Until then, walk." She left without sound, her reflection never touching the glass. He turned back to the mirrors, and for a breath thought he saw movement in the third from the end. A figure stepping away, its shoulders and height much like his own. When he followed her into the hall, it was empty. The faint scent of rain lingered, along with the sense of being watched from behind the wood and glass. Somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed, not sharply, but with the finality of a book returned to its shelf. Chapter 3. The Door That Was Not. A door Ralin walked until he could no longer tell whether the house turned around him or he around it. The halls repeated in the manner of rain, never the same drop twice, always the same wet on the skin. He passed a gallery hung with portraits, whose faces had been carefully erased and painted smooth again, a stair that climbed 5 turns and returned him to the landing where he began, a kitchen where a kettle steamed without fire and would not boil. He kept the grey cloth folded over his arm. Its weight altered with the rooms, lighter in the bright stretches, heavier where the light thinned. Sometimes he thought it pulled a little, as if it preferred one hallway to another, and when he indulged its pull, the boards were warmer underfoot, as if he had walked a frequented path. At a junction where 3 corridors met, he stopped. The air there was cooler, and a scent of wet leaves drifted through, as if a door had opened to a garden. No door stood there. The walls met cleanly, the wainscot ran unbroken. The corners kept their neat right angles. Yet the smell persisted, and along it came the faintest sound. Footfalls measured like his own, not approaching, not receding, simply existing in the same time. He chose the left-hand corridor. It narrowed until his shoulders nearly brushed the paneling, then opened into a room with a low ceiling crossed by beams darkened to the color of kettle iron. A table stood at the center, set with an open book. No words lay on the page. The paper held the faint impression of lines, as if writing had once rested there and moved on, leaving a suggestion rather than a record. There was a mirror on the far wall. He went to it and found not himself, but a bed with a lichen-colored coverlet and a pair of boots neatly placed upon the boards. A hand reached into view and took the boots away. He stood very still. No hand held his own boots where he stood. He touched his laces as if to confirm they remained. They did. He left the room and took the corridor opposite. It bent, narrowed, rose 3 shallow steps, bent again. A door stood half shut. Within, a fire burned low in a grate without ash, the coals pale as old bone, the heat real. Above the mantel hung a mirror wider than a man's reach. He faced it and saw the clearing beyond the tall windows, the grass unbent, the trees a black rank at the edge of light. In that grass stood a man looking up at high panes of wavering glass. The man had his hands upon the sill as if to climb, then lowered them and turned away. His face was turned from Ralin. His height, his set of shoulder, his habit of motion were his own. "When you see yourself," the woman had said. He breathed once and let it go. "When you see yourself, you will know the way." He waited until the figure moved again. The man in the mirror himself, or a life laid alongside his as a measuring rod, turned and faced the panes, so that his reflection would show in their night-dark glass. In the very instant when the face would have declared itself, the image thinned, the clearing faded, and the mirror showed only the low fire and the pale coals and Ralin's own hands upon the mantel. He stood a long time, palms cooling on stone. Then he lifted the grey cloth and spread a corner of it over the mirror's edge. The fabric took to the frame, as water takes to carved channels. He drew it across the glass. Where it covered, the surface did not vanish, it deepened. When the cloth crossed the center, the room's light bent inward as if drawn by a mouth. He stopped, left half the mirror bare, half-clothed. 2 rooms lay before him. On one side the chamber with its low fire, on the other the same chamber seen as through twilight rain. He stepped back, folded the cloth, and went on. Up a short stair, down a longer one, through a passage lit by a line of small windows set high. The house kept presenting itself like a deck of cards thumbed and bridged. The same faces, the same numbers, shuffled into new nearness. He came at last into a room whose ceiling rose like a chapel's, the height made greater by tall windows, blanked white with fog. A single chair stood in the middle. Upon it lay a key of bright metal, plain and honest, the sort that opens kitchen doors and chests. He did not take it. The grey cloth weighed more in that room than iron. He knew then the house was truthful in the manner of tides and seasons. The chair offered the wrong key and did not bother to lie about it. He passed on to a stair with shallow steps that drifted underfoot like sand. Halfway down he heard breathing, not the house's timbered settling, not his own steadying pace, someone else's breath, measured, near. "Raylan," said a voice he knew at once, and had not expected ever to hear again. It came from a doorway ahead, a tone shaped in his childhood and kept by the mind for dark hours. He entered. The room was narrow, lit by a single tall window whose glass was old enough to make the world beyond a wavering thing. A woman sat at a small table with a cup between her hands. She wore a plain dress the color of worked flax. Her hair, which he remembered as black, was threaded with gray. She lifted her eyes, and they were the same, clear as shallow river water in winter. "Mother," he said, and the word settled his bones and unseated them all at once. She smiled, not surprised. "You took your time," she said, "but you walked the right halls." He crossed to the table and did not reach for her hand. He feared to touch and find it colder than the air. "How are you here?" "The house keeps what is not claimed elsewhere," she said gently, echoing the woman's earlier speech without making it a lesson. "There are pieces of us that no place knows what to do with. This house holds them until someone comes who can carry them again." "I can carry you," he said, and knew as he spoke that the offer would be refused. "You can carry the knowing," she answered, "not the weight. Look at the window." He did. The glass held an image of the clearing, bright for a breath as if the fog had thinned. A narrow bed neatly made, boots aligned, tall windows letting in a thin grey day. A man stood in the middle distance with his hands on the sill. He turned his face. Roland saw himself, tired, younger than he felt, older than he had hoped. The mark on his jaw he had earned the winter. The river ice gave way beneath a plank. The sight knocked a sound from him that might have been a laugh if the chest had not been tight. "Now you have seen," his mother said softly. "You know the way." He took the grey cloth from his arm and looked at it with something like gratitude and something like distrust. "What will I owe?" "Whatever you lay down," she said. "The house is not a thief, it is a keeper. Decide what you can leave in its care and what you must take." He let out a breath he had been guarding. He did not ask her to come. He did not step forward for the embrace he longed for even now, a man with work in his hands. Instead, he reached and took the cup between her palms. It was warm. He set it down again, very carefully. "Tell me one thing that is mine to know," he said. She smiled as if pleased by the measure of the request. "You were stubborn," she said. "You bent when you found the right hinge." He nodded, and the room altered by a degree, as a winter morning alters when the first bird calls. He folded the cloth once, twice, until it lay as narrow as a sash. He tied it around his waist. The house adjusted to the knot. The hall straightened. The stairs that drifted took on edges. He felt, faint as a hair drawn across the back of his hand, a line present now that had been absent. Not a seam in the house, but in himself. He went back the way he had come, and the way was shorter. The room with the low fire received him as if it had been waiting, the pale coals breathing at his arrival. He faced the wide mirror. The glass gave him back the clearing again. The tall windows, the bed, the boots, the man at the panes, himself. Lifted his head and looked directly toward him. For a heartbeat, their gazes met across the thickness of a wall that was not a wall. Raylan drew the cloth from his waist, took one end in each hand, and cast it across the mirror as one casts a net over bright water. The fabric struck, caught, and sank without falling. The room's air pulled inward. The coals in the grate brightened as if fed. The mirror darkened and then cleared to a grey that was not glass. He stepped forward. The surface met him with the resistance of a cold river, skimmed with new ice, then yielded. He passed through. His boots found boards warmed by long light. He stood in the room with the tall windows. The bed was neatly made. His boots, those that had stood by the bed in the reflection, were not there because they were on his feet. The chair by the door was empty. The light slanted down, painting dust into threads as before. Behind him, the mirror held only his face, and then not even that. It returned to glass that showed a low fire, pale coals, a room without him. He lifted the latch on the door. It rose cleanly without groan. The hall beyond was the same and not the same. It smelled of sun-warmed wood, not of old rain. He walked the length of it once. It did not bend upon itself. At the stair, he paused and looked back only long enough to feel the first tug of the place begin and then ease. He went down. The front door stood open onto the clearing. The grass beyond was bent by wind at last, a simple, ordinary movement, like breath in sleep. He crossed the threshold. The air outside was brisk and held the scent of leaf and damp earth, nothing more. Behind him, the door did not close. He did not turn to draw it. The house could keep its door. He would keep the hinge he had found. At the edge of the clearing, he looked once toward the high windows. A figure stood there, small in that tall frame, hands folded upon a lap. The face was shadowed. He bowed his head in the manner one keeps for a room that has not betrayed him, and for those pieces a place is willing to hold until a hand can lift them again. The forest took him in with its accustomed sounds, the soft fall of leaf mold, the thread of water hidden in fern, the call of a bird that keeps to low branches. He walked until the house was only a thought of straight lines behind the trunks. When he reached the first field, the wind met him with the smell of rye and distant sea. He found that his name sat differently in his mouth. Still his, but resting in a new place, as if some weight had been moved from one pocket to another. He did not speak it aloud. He kept it for the next person who might ask, and for the moment when the day would require him to choose a door that was not a door and remember how to open it. Before the straight lines of the nameless house had fully thinned into trees, winter laid its hand upon the hills. Frost took the stubble in the fields and held it like wire. The wind that came off the high plain tasted of iron and old snow. Along the northern road, where mile markers lean and the ditches keep ice longer than the sun has patience for, there is a valley with a salt pan at its heart. When the river runs low and the cold takes the last of its motion, the flats gleam white as bone, and something wakes that winters there. The Salt Eater. Chapter 1. The Valley of White. The first hard freeze came early. It tightened doors in their frames and made the wells sing when buckets touched the rope. The elm by the blacksmith's shed cracked once in the night and stood silent until morning, as if embarrassed by its own voice. On the ridge above the village, smoke lifted in thin blue threads and then lay flat, pressed down by air that would not rise. Even walked the north road with a sack of barley over his shoulder and his collar turned high. He had mended boots and a coat lined with old wool, but the cold found the seam at his throat, and sat there, breathing against his skin. He kept to the edge where the ditch held a pale blaze. Each step rang faintly, as if the earth were a shallow bell. He had no wish to go by the salt pan. In winter, The place gathered sound in ways that did not belong to weather. But the west bridge was out. Ice had lifted the pilings and laid them down like picked bones, and the long way round would cost grain they could not spare. He chose the short road and kept his eyes upon the ruts worn by cartwheels, trusting habit where trust in other things failed. The valley opened suddenly. One breath, he walked between hedges brown as old rope. The next, the hedges fell away, and the world went to white. It lay in a wide bowl where summer water evaporated, leaving crust the color of driven snow. By day, the surface shone with a dull brightness that made the eyes ache. By night, it took moonlight and gave it back unbroken. In midwinter, when the river fell quiet and the ground rang with cold, a shape like a road ran across the pan, a path of duller white where no frost gathered. Even stopped where the road drew nearest the salt. The wind that had gnawed his ears a moment before seemed to hush at the pan's edge. Sound bent there. A dog barked far off, and the cry came flat, as if laid under a hand. He shifted the sack on his shoulder and began to walk again, counting steps as his father had taught him when he was a boy, and needed to cross a field in fog. He did not look at the path that ran white on white across the flats. He did not need to. Everyone who lived within a day's walk knew what followed that line when the cold had settled and the river no longer moved. A figure spare as the rib of a skiff, knees that did not bend as other knees do, a head that kept no features, a face could wear long. The first time an elder tells it, they speak softly. The last time, they only look at the window when frost writes there and say nothing. Halfway to the far hedge a sound came, not a footfall, not the crack of cold upon water, but a dry friction like a hand rubbed over stone. Even did not turn. The salt has a way of putting voices at your shoulder. He counted 63, 64, 65. He thought of grains settling in a sack, of the weight of it, of how a hand tests whether the cloth will hold. He made himself think of the miller's wife and the way she tied cords with her teeth when her hands were full. When he reached the ditch on the far side, he let out his breath in a long, quiet stream. He stepped onto frozen grass and listened. The dry friction hushed. The wind returned and took his breath sideways. He did not turn to look across the pan. He had been a clever boy once and had learned early that there are sights a body pays for twice. Once when it sees, and once when it sits alone and remembers. By the time he reached the village, the day had bent toward evening. The fields wore the color of iron filings. Smoke lay at roof height like a lid. He stepped into the mill house with the sack on his shoulder and found Mira binding a bundle of kindling with cord. She lifted her face, the lamplight laying a tidy gold upon her cheek. "You went the short way," she said, not unkind, not in rebuke, but as one names weather. "The bridge is down," he answered. "I counted my steps." She nodded. "And did it count you? Sit. Warm your hands. The stones are slow tonight." He set the sack by the bin and took the stool near the hearth. The heat went into his palms like good food. When he turned them toward the fire, he saw salt dust white in the creases of his cuffs. "It came early," Mira said, following his gaze. "The flats looked like snow all at once." The boys ran out to play at throwing, but their mothers called them back by the ear. He nodded. There was a sound on the pan. She tied the cord with her teeth and set the bundle aside. Not footsteps. No. "Then the old rule holds," she said. "If it is not walking yet, we have a week's peace, maybe two." Ivan rubbed his thumb over the salt dust and watched it shine. "And when it walks, then we do as we have done," she said. "We bind the doors and mark the lintels. We do not set bread to cool by the window. We do not give the dog the bones at the back step after dark." He smiled without humor. "And we do not cross the pan." She met his gaze. Even for a shortness that saves coin. You know this even. I know, he said. A man knows a thing and then learns it again with his feet. The stones began their slow speech, grain between them whispering, the haft creaking like a floorboard. Mira set the first scoop into the hopper, and the smell of cracked barley joined the smell of smoke and damp wool. When the grain was ground and sacked, and the cord tied twice, Ivan shouldered his share and stood in the doorway, looking at the night gathering across the yard. The sky had the color of iron cooled in water. A thin line of brightness lay in the west, where the last light had gone, and could not be persuaded to return. He turned his collar up and drew breath to wish Mira good night. "Take the long road," she said quietly, not turning from her work. "I would rather lose sleep than see the pan look back at me through our door." He nodded and stepped into the cold. The night took the warmth from his lips as he crossed the yard. Beyond the hedges, the road fell into a softness the feet find blind. He walked the way of carts and cows, feeling each rut's memory in the dark. He did not look toward the valley. At the second mile marker, the one with the split down its middle where a frost had once pried it open and then let it be, he heard the dry friction again. It came from the field to his right. He stopped. No wind moved the stand of dead thistle there. No hair crossed to leave its small stitching of prints. The sound went on for 3 breaths. Then it was still. He walked, and as he walked he spoke under his breath. The words had no charm in them, and belonged to no prayer a book would keep. He named things that were his. The left-hand hinge on his door that needed a shaving. The nick in the spoon he had used since his mother's day. The knot in the mill yard, where carts always chose to turn. He named his own shoulder, the ache of it at day's end, and the seam at his throat where the cold liked to live. He named the barley he carried and the cord that held it. He named Mira's lamp and the small gold it laid on her cheek when work ran late. He named until the sound left him, and he could hear only the thin cry of ice where the ditch narrowed and the fox's step in the hedge. When he reached his door, he did not lift the latch at once. He stood with his hand upon it and saw in his mind the white pan and the path across it where frost does not hold. He smelled the dry cold of salt and the far flat sea it remembers. He set his mouth and opened the door. Inside, the room kept its heat well. He set the sack down and laid his palms to the stove's side. The iron showed a faint blush where it was hottest. He felt his hands steady. Only then did he see what had been left upon the table. A line of fine white laid from one end to the other, straight as a scribe's rule. Not flour, not ash, salt. He stepped back without thinking and set his shoulders to the door until the latch met the iron with its honest sound. He did not call a name. He did not cross the line on the table. He stood and let the heat from the stove go into his back, while the cold of the salt pan rose through the soles of his feet by memory alone. After a time, he took a damp cloth and wiped the line away, slow, careful, as if erasing a measure someone had set there to test his hand. He wrung the cloth and watched the water bead. It shone like glass and did not fall at once. He banked the fire. He bound the door with the old cord hung by the frame for that purpose. He marked the lintel with what the elders had taught, simple and plain. He lay down with his coat for blanket and his boots near to hand. Sleep took him only when the stove showed no more blush and the iron had gone dull as stone. In the small hours, a dry sound crossed the yard. It did not touch the step. It did not try the latch. It measured the wall from corner to corner and went on. The house held. The valley of white lay where it lay. And beneath frost that pretended to be harmless as flour, something that does not eat in summer sharpened its hunger on the cold. Chapter 2. The First Taking. The next morning broke without color. The frost on the panes held its lace until the sun cleared the far ridge, and even then it let go only reluctantly. Even woke with the sense that someone had stepped away from the bed a moment before, though the floorboards kept no memory of weight. He dressed with care and checked the cord on the door before unlatching it. The yard was still, the troughs glazed. In the ash by the woodpile there were two marks side by side, not hoof, not boot, not the three-pronged drag of the heron. The shape was long, narrow, pressed deeper at one end, as if something had leaned its weight forward to test the ground. The prince led away toward the road and did not return. By the time he reached the mill, the air had warmed enough to let the frost fall from the eaves in slow drops. Mira stood at the hopper, sleeves rolled, hair bound close. She looked up once and then again, her gaze resting longer. "There is salt in your hair," she said. He brushed a hand through it. The grit stung his fingertips. "From last night." She shook her head. "It doesn't cling unless it's fresh." They worked without further talk, though her glance kept straying to the window. Midway through the morning, a boy came running from the south road. He carried no coat, though his breath showed white. He stopped in the doorway, bent over his knees and said only, "Elder wants you." Both. The elder's house stood at the village edge, facing the wide meadow where in summer sheep grazed, and in winter the snow lay longer than elsewhere. Inside, the air was warm from the fire, but no comfort rose from it. 3 others stood with the elder, the smith, the weaver, and Pan from the ferry who had not crossed the river in a month. On the table lay a folded coat, the kind a carter wears, and beside it a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The elder lifted the bundle's edge to show what lay within. 3 fingers, pale as wax, crusted with white. Myra drew in a sharp breath. "Found at the west end of the pan," the elder said. "The bridge there's gone, so he must have taken the short way." "Who was it?" Even asked. "Roll from the tannery. Went out at dawn to fetch hides stored at the shed by the ford." The weaver crossed herself without a word. "Tracks?" Mira asked. "The frost's too hard to take them, but there was a line across the salt where no rime lay." No one spoke for a long moment. The elder's fire popped once, and the sound startled no one. "We'll mark the doors tonight," the elder said. "Every lintel. No one walks alone before full light. No one walks after dusk." The smith's jaw set. "And if it comes into the yards?" The elder's gaze went to the window. "Then we pray the marks hold, and we do not open for any voice that speaks our name." That night, Even set the barley sack against the door, and bound the cord twice. He marked the lintel and the sill, and kept the lamp burning low. Outside, the frost thickened until the moonlight slid from it without catching. In the deepest part of night, a sound came along the road. Not footsteps, not cartwheels, but the dry, steady rasp of weight shifted over salt. It passed the house once, then again, then stopped. A voice spoke from just beyond the wall. It was Mira's voice. "Ivan, the grain's gone over. Come help." He closed his eyes and let the words wash against the marks on the lintel. They did not answer. The voice came again, closer. "It's spilling. Come." He said nothing. The cold in the room deepened, and the lamp's flame bent as if pushed. Then the weight shifted away. The dry rasp moved down the road, and the night held. At dawn, the yard bore no trace, save for a lone impression by the entrance, an extended, slender mark deeply imprinted at one terminus. In the third day's light, the heavens had assumed a hue-defying description, neither blue nor gray, but an unnamed tone tinged with the metallic taste of iron. The cold carried a stillness that made each sound stand apart, so that a dropped ladle in the mill yard was heard at the farthest house. Even spent the morning mending the shutter hinge in his loft, but his thoughts drifted to the west road. Word had gone round that a pair from the Smiths family had not returned from their trapline. At midday the elder sent 4 to look, each with marked staves, each warned to walk only in sight of the others. When they returned before dusk, they brought the traps, but no catch. The youngest of the 4 would not speak. Salt dust clung to his coat from knee to hem. The elder called the village together in the meeting hall. Smoke from the lamps rose straight, untroubled by any draught, as if even the air listened. "It walks now," the elder said. "There will be no travel until the thaw. If a store runs short, call for what you need." But no one. His gaze swept the room. No one steps into the road alone. An old woman asked if the marks on the lintel would hold. The elder's mouth tightened. "If the door is closed and the lamps are kept, yes." "And if it calls the way it did for Roland's boy?" someone asked. The elder shook his head. "Then you do not answer. And you pray. The one it seeks remembers his own name long enough to keep the latch down." That night, Even ate at the mill. Mira set bread and root stew before him, the steam fragrant with herbs she had kept from summer. They spoke little, and when the lamps were trimmed, they checked each window and door twice. The frost outside thickened into ridges like the grain of sand on the Tide Ave flat. The moon rode low, its light bent pale in the cold. Past midnight, the first sound came. The dry rasp, moving slow, deliberate, as though the thing that made it had all the hours it could want. It circled the mill once. The grain in the bins settled, as if under a weight. Then the voice came, not Myra's this time, but his own. "Even, it's cold out here. Let me in." The lamp nearest the door flared and guttered. The marks on the lintel caught the light for an instant and then seemed to dim. The voice spoke again, closer to the sill. "Even, the stew's still warm. Let me in." He felt Myra's hand on his sleeve, hard enough to bruise. "Don't move," she breathed. The rasp shifted to the wall by the hearth. A shadow passed over the small window there, but no shape could be seen. Only the dimming of the moonlight. Hours passed in that slow siege. Each time the voice spoke, it was his, shaped around words he had spoken in the last day or two. Once it laughed, a sound that in another place might have been harmless. Here it was as sharp as the edge of broken salt. Toward morning, the rasp moved away, each pass of it fainter. The frost on the panes began to melt in narrow trails where the first light touched. When they unbarred the door, the yard was marked from corner to corner with that long, narrow print, pressed deeper at one end. It led to the road, where the white of the frost ended and the white of the pan began, and there it vanished. The elder came at midday. "It knows the shape of you now," he told Ivan. "It will keep trying until the thaw. Don't let it find the place your name lives." That night, and for many after, Ivan slept in the loft with the cord wound around his wrist and the grey of the salt in his dreams. The Thousand-Year Lily Reprise, Chapter 1, After the Bloom. When the thaw came, it came slowly, in threads and beads, in the sound of water loosening from the grip of roots. The marsh that had slept under frost began to stir. Thin mists drifted low, smelling faintly of peat, and something green returned. Mira walked there again, as she had a year before when the bloom had come. She carried no lantern. The light of day was enough, though it was pale and new. The place where the lily had lifted its white crown lay as it had. Black water, sedge bending, no mark of the 1000th night. She stood a long while, her breath moving in small clouds, and thought of the gathering faces lit from below, the glow on water, the quiet after. She had not spoken of it since. The words seemed too loud for what had passed. A heron rose from the shallows, its wings slow, its call low in the throat. Ripples spread, touching the place where the root slept again. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, and the sound reached her softened by distance. The ground under her boots was softening with the thaw. In some places the ice still clung. In others the moss gave underfoot. She stepped from hummock to hummock, careful as before, until she reached the inlet where the clearer water entered. There, at the edge, she saw a single leaf rising, thick, green, unspotted, the surface holding a film of thaw's first warmth. She touched it once. It did not stir, but she thought of the heat within the lily's heart, and the gold so fine it might have been woven. The wind turned, bringing the smell of open water. Merith lifted her eyes to the far hills. The snow still lay on their flanks, but the air between was bright. She stepped back to the bank, leaving the leaf to the sun. By the time she reached the village, the roofs were shedding their frost. A man stacking wood paused and looked toward the marsh, his eyes fixed on nothing she could see. She thought of the watchers, how they had stood without speaking. Some of them were gone now, taken by time as much as by distance. The marsh would hold its secret for another 1,000 years, if such years were given. The bloom would come again, and others would stand where she had stood. But this morning, the water kept only the faintest memory of light, and the air held only the quiet work of thaw. Merith crossed her own threshold, set her boots aside, and poured water to warm on the hearth. Outside, the wind moved over the thawing ground, carrying no voices, no glow, only the promise that something deep in the black water still waited in its own time. Closing Echo Merith poured the warmed water into the basin, steam rising in a thin ribbon that caught the light from the hearth. She paused a moment, watching it drift and fade. Outside, the wind had softened, carrying scents from farther off. Leaf mold, open water, the faintest trace of something sweet from the hills. In that quiet, she thought of places she had never seen but now felt she might know. A plateau where silver fruit swayed in the wind's long breath. A grove where lanterns hummed until their light walked away. A pond that held another sky. A loom house whose threads kept the wind at bay. A high hollow where a bone frame burned against the sea. A house that remembered the names it was given. A valley where white salt sharpened its hunger in the cold. The marsh held none of these, yet its still water seemed kin to them. She felt, as one feels when stepping from shadow into sunlight, that each place had its season, and each season had left a trace here in the gold of the lily's heart, in the air's patient, turning toward warmth. She set the basin on the table and crossed to the window. The thawed pools reflected only the pale sky, but she knew that, below, unseen, something still waited in its own time. Merith let the curtain fall and moved toward the hearth, the day ahead opening in its slow, unhurried way. Somewhere, another candle was being lit, another tale beginning its first quiet breath.